The storm came in off the Kansas plain like God himself had grown tired of patience, and Pauline Conley had run out of options 3 miles back. She had been driving that battered wagon since before first light, 6 children huddled beneath 2 wool blankets in the wagon bed behind her. The oldest boy, Thomas, 12 years and trying his hardest to look brave, and the youngest, baby Clara, not yet 2, pressed against her sister Ruth's chest for warmth. The rain had started as a drizzle somewhere past the creek crossing, and had built itself into something furious and sideways by the time the wheel struck the rut that nearly sent them all into the mud. Pauline had managed to keep the horse steady, had managed to keep the wagon upright, but she had not managed to keep her sense of direction, and somewhere in the hammering dark she had turned onto a road she did not recognize and followed it simply because it was a road and roads had to lead somewhere. It was the year 1878, and the Kansas frontier was not a kind place for a woman alone. She had left Hardin Creek 2 days prior with everything she owned packed into that wagon and a letter from her dead husband's brother folded in her coat pocket. The letter was not a kind one. It informed her, in language so formal it burned like acid, that the property upon which she and her children had been living for the past 4 years technically belonged to the Conley family estate, and that upon the death of her husband, Warren Conley, the land reverted to blood relatives. She had 30 days. The letter was already 3 weeks old when she found it beneath the floorboard where Warren had apparently hidden it, whether out of shame or procrastination she could not say, because Warren had been dead for 6 months and could not answer for anything anymore. She was 31 years old. She had 6 children ranging from 12 to not yet 2. She had $27, a horse named Governor who was getting on in years, the wagon, 3 trunks of clothing and household goods, a cast iron skillet, a Bible, and no clear destination. She had a sister in Abilene who she had not spoken to in 7 years, and she was headed there on the slim hope that blood was thicker than old arguments. But she had taken a wrong turn in the dark and the rain, and when the faint yellow rectangle of light appeared through the downpour like a lantern held up by the hand of mercy, she pulled Governor toward it without a second thought. The light was a window. The window belonged to a house. The house sat at the end of a short drive lined with cottonwood trees that swayed and roared in the wind, and behind the house she could make out the dark shapes of a barn and 2 outbuildings. It was a proper spread, she registered dimly, even in her exhausted and soaked-through state. Someone had put real work into this place. She pulled Governor to a stop in front of the covered porch and set the brake with hands that shook from cold and from something deeper than cold. "You children stay put," she said over her shoulder, and she climbed down from the wagon seat and walked through the curtain of rain to the door and she knocked. She knocked 3 times, solid and firm, because whatever else she was, Pauline Conley was not a timid woman. Inside the house, Micah Bancroft had been sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a surveying map he had already studied until the lines blurred. He had been sitting there since supper, which he had eaten alone as he ate every meal, at a table built for a family he did not have. He was 34 years old and he had been on this land for 6 years, having come down from Missouri after the war work dried up, and a man he trusted told him the Kansas prairie was a place where a person could build something real. He had built something real. The house was solid, 2 stories, 4 bedrooms that he rotated through when the emptiness of having only one of them occupied made him restless. He had 640 acres, a good barn, a small herd of cattle, 2 horses and a mule, and a reputation in the nearby town of Millhaven as a fair dealer and a reliable man. What he did not have was a single soul to share it with. He was not a man who spoke often about loneliness. He had tried once to court a schoolteacher who had come out from Ohio, but she had gone back to Ohio after 1 winter, and he had not begrudged her that choice, only quietly accepted it as one more confirmation of something he had begun to believe about himself. that the life he had built was too large and too quiet and too much for most people, that he had somehow built the bones of a family without the family to fill it. His dog, a big brindle hound named Sergeant, raised his head from the rug by the stove when the knock came. Micah looked at the door as though not fully believing what he had heard. The knock came again. 3 solid raps, unhesitating. He stood up, reached for the rifle that hung by the door out of habit, thought better of it, and opened the door instead. She was standing in the rain without a hat, her dark hair plastered to her face, her coat soaked black, her eyes steady and brown and the color of creek water after a storm. She was tall for a woman, with a jaw set in the particular way of a person who has decided not to beg no matter what happens next. Behind her, through the rain, he could see the wagon and the pale shapes of children's faces looking out from beneath a canvas. "I beg your pardon," she said, and her voice was low and clear despite the cold. "I have taken a wrong turn in the dark, and I have 6 children in that wagon, and I need to know if there is shelter for the horse and somewhere dry for them to sleep. I can pay for it. I have money." Micah Bancroft looked at her for one long moment. He had been waiting his whole life for something, though he had never been able to name exactly what it was. Some men named it fortune. Some men named it purpose. He had always privately thought it was something simpler and more impossible than either of those things. Looking at this woman in the rain with her steady eyes and her rain-soaked dignity and her 6 children behind her, something in the center of his chest moved in a way it had not moved in 34 years of living. "Ma'am," he said, stepping back and opening the door wide, "put your horse in the barn. Every one of you come inside. You don't owe me a cent." Her name was Pauline. He learned that before the children had finished tracking mud across his kitchen floor. There were 6 of them, and they came in a cascade. Thomas first, because he was 12 and had appointed himself guardian of the group, his dark eyes sweeping the room with the wariness of a boy who had learned that new places meant new dangers. Then Eliza, who was 10 and had her mother's jaw and her father's height already, ducking through the door with a trunk held in both arms that should have required a grown man. Then the twins, Samuel and Daniel, 8 years old and identical in everything including the mud they had accumulated, tumbling through the door elbow to elbow. Then June, who was 5 and had ringlets the color of autumn wheat, and immediately found Sergeant the Hound and flung her arms around his neck with complete fearlessness. And finally Ruth, who was 4 and half asleep on her feet, and who was carrying baby Clara against her chest with a solemnity that made Micah's throat do something complicated. "Set the baby down, sweetheart," Pauline said, taking Clara from Ruth's arms with practiced ease, and then she looked around the kitchen with those steady brown eyes and she said, "This is very kind of you." "There's a stove going in the front room," Micah said, because he could not think of what else to say and because it was true. "And I'll get blankets." He got blankets. He also got the children settled in front of the fire with the remainder of the venison stew he had made that evening, which was more than enough for 6 because he always made more than enough out of some stubborn optimism he could not explain. He got dry wood stacked high, and he heated water for the younger ones, and he showed Thomas where the barn was so the boy could help stable governor, because Thomas had the look of a child who needed to be given something useful to do in order to feel safe. And all the while Pauline moved through his house with a quiet efficiency that suggested she was not the kind of woman to sit still when there was work to be done, even in someone else's home, even after 2 days of hard travel in the rain. She had baby Clara settled and sleeping in a nest of blankets near the fire before Micah had finished bringing in the last of the dry wood, and she was heating milk for June, and she had somehow located his dishcloth and was wiping mud from Samuel's face while Daniel watched with the detached interest of a boy who was very glad the cloth was not currently on his own face. "You have a fine house," she said, not stopping the wiping. "Thank you," he said. "Bigger than I need." She looked up at him then, quick and direct, and he had the sudden feeling she understood more from those 5 words than he had intended to give away. "I'm Pauline Conley," she said, "out of Hardin Creek, "These are my children, Thomas, Eliza. The twins are Samuel and Daniel, then June, and the baby is Clara." "Micah Bancroft," he said. "I've been on this land 6 years. The town is Millhaven, 3 miles east." "Millhaven," she repeated as though filing it away. "I know of it. I have been traveling toward Abilene." "You're a good way off course," he said, not unkindly. "I am aware of that," she said, and there was the ghost of something dry and self-deprecating in her voice that made him want to smile. Thomas came back in from the barn, rain-drenched but satisfied-looking, and reported that Governor was stabled and fed, and the horse seemed grateful. And Micah told him he had done a good job with the conviction of a man who meant it, and the boy stood a little straighter. That night, Micah gave up his bedroom to Pauline and Clara and Ruth, and the older children arranged themselves in the other upstairs rooms with the cheerful adaptability of children who had been sleeping in a wagon for 2 days and considered any horizontal surface a luxury. Micah stretched out on the settee in the front room with Sargent pressed warm against his legs, and he lay there listening to the rain on the roof and the quiet sounds of a house that was no longer empty, and he thought that he had never in his life been less able to sleep and less troubled by that fact. In the morning the storm had passed, and the world was washed clean and golden. Pauline was up before him, which he discovered when he came downstairs to find coffee already made and June sitting on the kitchen floor feeding biscuit crumbs to Sargent with an expression of angelic innocence that suggested the biscuits had been unauthorized. "June," Pauline said from the stove without turning around, "Sargent is not a dustpan." June looked at Micah. Micah kept his face very still. "Good morning," Pauline said, turning now, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and caught the angles of her face in a way that made something in him go very quiet and very attentive. She had her hair pinned up and she was wearing a dress that was slightly wrinkled from being packed but clean, and she held out a cup of coffee with the matter-of-fact ease of a woman who had been making coffee in this kitchen for years. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, but the cup was warm. "I owe you an explanation and possibly a plan," she said, turning back to the stove. "Last night you were gracious enough not to ask for either." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I do," she said firmly. "My husband died 6 months ago, Pauline Conley. He had a failing of the lungs that the doctor called consumption. He was a good man in most of the ways that matter and a foolish man in some of the ways that also matter. And among the foolish things he did was fail to tell me that the land we lived on was not ours to keep. His brother has claimed it back. So I am taking my children to my sister in Abilene, and hoping she is in a more charitable mood than her last letter suggested." She said all of this to the stove, and her voice was very level, and Micah could hear everything she was not saying underneath the level words. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good father. The children miss him terribly." She paused. "I miss him too, though it is a complicated kind of missing when someone is gone before they have finished explaining the choices they made." He did not push further. Instead, he asked if she intended to set out today, and she said she had hoped to, weather permitting, though she wanted to check Governor's near foreleg, which had seemed stiff when Thomas stabled him last night. Micah went out to the barn and checked Governor's foreleg himself, and the news was not good. The horse had a swelling just below the knee that wanted rest and cold compresses, not 40 more miles of trail. He came back in and told her so, and he watched her face go through a series of calculations that she kept very controlled, and then she looked at him and said, "How long?" 3 days at minimum," he said. "Possibly 5. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and said, "We will pay for the board, for ourselves and the horse. I insist on it." "You won't," he said. "I have more room than I need and more food than one man can eat before it turns. You'd be doing me a service." She looked at him with that direct brown gaze, and he got the feeling she was trying to determine whether he was telling the truth or being kind. He was being both, but he let her arrive at that conclusion herself. 3 days, she said. Then we move on. Thomas and Eliza and the twins had already found the yard by the time breakfast was fully on the table, and Micah looked out the window to see Thomas examining the fence line with the focused attention of a boy who understood what good carpentry looked like. Sargent was racing figure eights around all four of them with his tongue out and his ears flying. "Thomas is good with his hands," Pauline said, following his gaze. "He looks like he knows what he's looking at," Micah agreed. "Warren taught him," she said, "before he got too sick to be in the yard." Over breakfast, which was eggs and biscuits and the rest of the morning's coffee, Micah learned more about Pauline Conley than he had learned about any person in years, not because she talked excessively, but because she answered his questions with unusual directness. She was from Missouri originally, had come west with Warren in 1870 when Thomas was 4 years old. She had given birth to every one of her children in Kansas. She had learned to keep a kitchen garden, to preserve meat, to doctor minor ailments with whatever was at hand. She had helped Warren pull fence posts and had helped him build the chicken coop they eventually lost to a fox. She had done these things not because she was required to, but because it was her home and you took care of what was yours. She asked him questions in return, which surprised him pleasantly. She asked about the land, about the cattle operation, about Millhaven, and whether it was a town worth knowing. He told her about the land with the particular quiet passion of a man who had built something from prairie and elbow grease, and who did not often get asked about it. He told her about the cattle, about the good grass on the eastern pasture, about the creek that ran through the North Quarter and had never gone dry even in the worst of the summer drought years. He told her about Millhaven, which had a general store run by a man named Aldrich who was fair on prices, a church that held services on Sunday and doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, a smithy, a doctor of moderate competence, and a saloon which he visited rarely. "It sounds like a decent place," she said. "It is," he said. "It's not a grand place, but it's decent." Those 3 days stretched into 5, because Governor's leg was slower healing than expected, and Pauline made no comment on it except to increase her contributions to the household work in a way that made it impossible for Micah to object without being ungracious. She cooked. She cleaned. She organized the children into a system of small chores that Micah found quietly remarkable in its engineering, each child assigned according to age and capacity. Thomas carrying wood and checking on the animals, Eliza sweeping and helping with Clara, the twins fetching water and feeding the chickens, June keeping Clara entertained with a patience that surprised him for a 5-year-old, and Ruth following Pauline from room to room like a small shadow. Micah found himself restructuring his days to accommodate the strange and wonderful fact of other people. He took Thomas out to check the fence line on the east pasture because the boy had been eyeing it and it needed checking, and they rode side by side on a morning that smelled like wet sage and fresh mud, and Thomas asked careful, intelligent questions about the cattle and about the land, and Micah answered them with the pleasure of a man who had been wanting someone to ask. "My father used to say that land was the only honest thing," Thomas said, somewhere out on the eastern edge, looking out across the flat gold distance. "Your father sounds like he was a smart man," Micah said. "He was," Thomas said. "He just got sick." He said it without self-pity, the way children say true things that adults have not yet learned to say cleanly. In the evenings the house was full of noise in a way Micah had forgotten houses could be. The twins argued about everything with cheerful vigor. June asked questions in an uninterrupted stream that covered topics ranging from why the sky was blue to whether Sargent had dreams, and whether the dreams were about rabbits. Eliza read aloud from the Bible by the fire with a seriousness that Micah respected, the words rolling out in her clear young voice, while Clara slept in the crook of Pauline's arm. Ruth sat always close to her mother, watching Micah with wide eyes that slowly, over the days, shifted from wariness to something more like assessment. It was Ruth who spoke to him first on the 4th evening. She came and stood beside his chair while he was mending a piece of tack, and she looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Are you lonely?" The question hit him somewhere undefended. "Sometimes," he said. Ruth considered this. "We are lonely too," she said, "even though there are a lot of us." He did not know what to say to that, and so he said nothing. But he looked across the room to where Pauline was settling Clara, and he found her already looking at him. And the expression on her face was something he could not entirely read, except that it was not hostile and it was not indifferent, and he looked away first. On the fifth day, Governor's leg was well enough. Micah checked it in the morning and told Pauline honestly that the horse could travel carefully on a good road. She thanked him. She gathered the children with the efficiency he had come to recognize as her particular genius. She packed the wagon. She brought order to chaos in the space of an hour, and when she came to find him in the yard to settle what she called their account, she was carrying $20 folded into her hand, and her expression was the one she had been wearing when she arrived, set and dignified and determined not to beg. "I cannot take your money," he said. "You must," she said, "or I cannot in good conscience go." He looked at the $20 and he looked at her and he said something he had not planned to say. "Stay," he said. She looked at him. "Not like that," he said quickly, though in fact it was very much like that and he thought she probably knew it. "I mean, I have a proposal, a practical one. My east pasture fence needs rebuilding and I have a cattle drive to organize by spring and I cannot run this operation alone any longer. Thomas is old enough to work for wages and he's a quick learner. You and the children could have the use of the house, the upstairs. I could take the rooms above the barn. You could cook and manage the household and I would pay you fair wages until you decide where you are going next." She was very still. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Micah," he said. She almost smiled. Then she was serious again. "That is a very generous offer." "It is a practical offer," he said, which was partly true. "People would talk," she said. "People in Millhaven are going to talk regardless," he said. "A widow with 6 children passing through is already a subject of conversation. You staying on as a housekeeper and hired hand is a more scandalous thing but a more honest one, and I would rather be honest than merely proper." She looked at him for a very long time, and he made himself hold her gaze because he meant what he was offering and he wanted her to know he meant it. "A month," she said finally. "I will stay 1 month. We reassess at the end of it, and you will be paid for the days we already used because I will not be in debt to anyone." He accepted this, and he moved his things to the barn room, which was tighter but not uncomfortable, and the house settled back into noise and fullness and the particular warmth of inhabited space. The month was, for Micah Bancroft, the most disorienting and altering 30 days of his life. He had understood before that he was lonely. He had not understood the specific dimensions of that loneliness until the house was full and he could compare the before and after directly. He had not understood that meals eaten alone are a different category of experience from meals eaten, with 6 children arguing about who got the bigger biscuit, or that evenings were a different thing when they included other people breathing and moving through the same rooms, or that morning had an entirely different quality when someone else had already made the coffee. He watched Pauline with the careful attention of a man who knows he is watching something important. She was not an easy woman in the sense of being simple or pliable. She had opinions and she stated them, usually once, and she did not repeat herself. She disagreed with him about the best route for the east pasture fence and she turned out to be correct, which she did not mention afterward. She had a capacity for stillness that he found remarkable, the way she could sit with Clara on her lap and simply be present, not fidgeting, not performing anything, just there. And she had a laugh, low and sudden, that appeared rarely enough to be a thing worth working for. She was not trying to charm him. That was perhaps the thing he kept returning to. She was simply being herself, clearly and without decoration, and it was the most compelling thing he had encountered in his 34 years. Thomas was, as Micah had guessed, an extraordinary young worker. The boy had his mother's directness and his father's hands, big and capable for 12, and he attacked the fence line with a focus that made the other ranchers who came by to introduce themselves blink twice. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were allowed to help with the lighter animal chores, and they did so with competitive enthusiasm that resulted in the chickens being fed twice on Tuesday and not at all on Thursday, which Eliza pointed out with the measured disdain of an older sister. Eliza, meanwhile, had discovered Micah's shelf of books, 4 of them, and had read through all of them within the first 2 weeks and had begun reading them again. He rode into Millhaven and came back with 2 more from the general store, where Aldrich kept a small selection, and the look on Eliza's face when he handed them to her was something he was not going to forget. Pauline saw him do it, and she did not say anything at the time, but that evening when the children were in bed, she came downstairs and found him by the fire, and she said, very quietly, "That was very kind." "She's a reader," he said. "She ought to have things to read." Pauline sat down in the other chair across the fire from him, and they sat in silence for a while, which was a comfortable kind of silence rather than the uncomfortable kind, and then she said, "I need to write to my sister in Abilene." "I can take a letter to Millhaven tomorrow," he said. "I should tell her I am not coming," she said. "Not yet, she will be relieved. We did not part on the best terms." He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, the flames making her face warm and amber. "What did you argue about?" he asked. She considered. "She thought I married too young and too fast and too far from home." She was right about all 3 of those things, but I was 19 and stubborn, and I loved Warren, and so I went, and we never quite found our way back to easy with each other. 6 years is a long time to be out of easy with someone, he said. "It is," she said, "though I think we are both too proud to fix it properly and too fond of each other to let it go entirely." "That sounds like siblings," he said. "Do you have them?" she asked. "Siblings. 1 brother," he said. "Older. He stayed in Missouri. Has a farm there, a wife, 5 children. We write at Christmas." "That sounds like brothers," she said, and this time she did smile, small and sideways, and he felt it like a match struck in a dark room. "Pauline," he said, and then stopped, because he had not planned what came next. She looked at him. "I find that I would like very much for you to stay," he said, "past the month. I know that is not what we agreed, and I know I am not being strictly practical about it." She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. From upstairs came the muffled sound of one of the twins talking in his sleep. "Micah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without being prompted, and it sat in the air between them like something lit. "I find that I would very much like to stay too, and that frightens me." "Why does it frighten you?" he asked. She looked back at the fire. "Because I have done this before. I have made a choice based on feeling, and I have followed a man into the unknown, and it was a good choice, and I do not regret it, but Warren is dead, and I have 6 children, and my margins are very thin. I cannot afford to make a choice based only on feeling again." "Then make it based on feeling and sense together," he said. "Take your time. There is no hurry." She turned to look at him then, full on, and the expression on her face was something he thought he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. "You are a very patient man," she said. "I have been waiting for something my whole life," he said. "I am beginning to think I was right to wait." She looked at him for a long beat, and then she stood up and said good night and went upstairs, and he sat by the fire with Sargent and thought about patience and about the way his name had sounded in her voice, and he felt something in him that was large and quiet and entirely certain. The month ended and she did not leave. They did not speak directly about it. She simply stayed, and he simply let her stay, and the practical arrangement continued, except that Micah began to feel that calling it a practical arrangement was like calling the Kansas sky merely large. It was technically accurate and entirely inadequate. He rode into Millhaven in the 3rd week of November, about 6 weeks after Pauline and the children had arrived, and he had a conversation with the Reverend Hollies at the church that he had not planned to have. He had gone in to pay for the schoolroom's use, because he had arranged with the Reverend for Eliza and the twins to attend the weekday school, and Hollies was a decent man with a tidy white beard who had the rare quality of not inserting himself where he was not asked. "Except today," Hollies said, carefully, "people in town have been asking after the family staying at your place." "I expect they have," Micah said. "The widow Conley," Hollies said. "She came in Sunday with all those children, sat in the 3rd row. She sang the hymns in a fine, clear voice. She does, Micah agreed. Fine woman, Holly said, not leading, just stating. She is, Micah said. Hollis looked at him with the measured patience of a man who has listened to confessions in many forms. I just want you to know, he said, that this church would stand behind whatever path you chose to take, if you were to choose one. Micah bought a length of ribbon at Aldrich's store on the way back, dark blue, because he had noticed Pauline had looked at the blue fabric in the bolt near the window. He did not know what she would do with ribbon, and he did not have a sophisticated plan. He simply knew he wanted to bring her something. He gave it to her in the yard when he got back, just held it out without a speech. She took it and looked at it and then looked at him. "What is this for?" she asked. "Nothing specific," he said. "I thought you might like it." She ran her thumb along the ribbon's edge, watching him with those steady brown eyes, and then she said very quietly, "Thank you, Micah." That evening she wore the ribbon in her hair at supper, and June immediately demanded to know where the ribbon had come from and whether she could have one too. And Samuel said ribbons were foolish, and Daniel punched Samuel in the arm for saying so in front of their mother. And Thomas watched all of this from the end of the table with the small private smile of a 12-year-old who was beginning to understand more than the adults realized. In December, the first real snow came. It came quietly, not like the autumn storm, but like something considered, and in the morning the prairie was white and still and enormous. Micah found Pauline standing on the porch before sunrise in her coat, watching it, and he came out and stood beside her without speaking. They stood there for a while in the cold and the white silence. "It's beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. "Warren never liked winter," she said. He said it reminded him that the land was in charge, not him. "I always thought that was the reason to like it." "I like it," he said. "It's honest. Everything stops pretending it's something it isn't." She turned to look at him at that, and something shifted in her expression, something that had been held at a particular careful distance beginning to close that distance, and he was very aware of how close they were standing. "Micah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not ready," she said. "I want you to know that I see what is between us, and I am not pretending it isn't there, but I am not ready yet." "I know," he said. "Warren has been gone 8 months," she said, "and there are the children to consider. What it would mean for them, what they have already been through." "I know all of that," he said. "I am not asking anything." "You never do," she said. "That is one of the things about you." "One of what things?" he said. She turned back to the snow. "The things I am trying not to think about too much," she said, and there was the ghost of a smile in her voice that made the cold morning feel warmer than it had any right to. Christmas came, and Micah learned that Pauline Conley's approach to Christmas was a serious and magnificent undertaking. She had Ruth and June cutting paper stars at the kitchen table for 3 days. She had Thomas and Eliza out cutting a small cedar tree that she installed in the front room and decorated with the paper stars, and with strips of red cloth, and with a string of dried berries that June had contributed with tremendous pride. She made a spice cake and a venison roast, and a pudding that she would not let anyone taste until Christmas Day, with a firmness that brooked absolutely no appeal. Micah went into Millhaven 3 days before Christmas and came back with oranges and peppermint sticks, and a doll for Clara that had glass eyes and a painted china face, which he had ordered from the catalog at the general store a month ago without knowing exactly why, only that Clara did not have a doll. On Christmas morning, Clara saw the doll and made a sound that Micah thought might be the best sound he had ever heard in his life, a pure astonished delight, and she clutched it to her chest and pressed her face against it, and would not put it down for the remainder of the day. Pauline saw his face watching Clara, and she saw the particular expression on it, and something in her own face did something quiet and irrevocable. After the children were in bed on Christmas night, she came downstairs again as she sometimes did, and this time she sat closer to the fire and she said, "You bought Clara that doll a month ago." "Yes," he said. "You planned ahead," she said. "I try to," he said. "For a woman and 6 children you barely knew," she said. He looked at her. "I knew you well enough," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up and she said, Warren used to say that love was a decision more than a feeling. That you decided to love someone and then the feeling followed. Did he? Micah said. I used to argue with him about that, she said. I thought the feeling came first. What do you think now? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. I think, she said slowly, that sometimes you feel something so fast that you spend a long time telling yourself you didn't because the alternative is very frightening. He was very still. She looked at him steadily, with those brown eyes that had been leveling him since the first night he opened the door to the rain, and she said, I thought you were the wrong door. I thought I had made a mistake, knocking on a stranger's door in the dark. And now? He asked, and his voice was quieter than he intended. Now I think, she said, that there may not be such a thing as the wrong door, only the door you knock on and what is on the other side of it. He moved without planning to, crossing the distance between the chairs and kneeling in front of her, which was not a practiced or elegant thing, only an honest one, and he took her hands in both of his and said, Pauline. Micah, she said. I am not going to pretend I haven't been falling in love with you since the moment you appeared in the rain on my doorstep with your steady eyes and your 6 children and your $20, he said. I'm going to say it plainly because I have been a plain man my whole life and I am too old to start being otherwise. I love you. I would like to be a husband to you and a father to your children if you will have me, and I understand that is an enormous thing to ask and I will wait as long as you need. Her hands tightened on his. You have been patient, she said, and her voice had something in it that was not steady, the first time he had heard it not steady. I have learned to be, he said. I love you too, she said. It frightens me and it is true. He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there for a moment, and the fire burned, and the house was full of sleeping children, and the Kansas winter was pressing cold against the windows, and he thought that he had never in his 34 years been so entirely exactly where he was supposed to be. They were married in the spring. It was a Saturday in April of 1879, which came in warm and green after the hard winter, the prairie alive with the particular desperate beauty of a plain spring, wildflowers pushing up along every fence line, the cottonwoods going pale gold with new leaves, the sky that enormous bowl of blue that had nothing bashful about it. The ceremony was at Reverend Hollis's church in Millhaven, which was small and plain and smelled of wood polish and the memory of other people's happiness. Pauline wore a dress that was not white. It was her good dress, a deep rose that had been her mother's color, and that she had adjusted and pressed until it was as fine as anything in Millhaven had seen in some time. Micah wore his good dark coat and had his hair cut at the barber, and stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who cannot believe his own fortune, and is trying very hard not to show it, which meant it showed on every inch of his face. Thomas stood up with him, because Micah had asked him, man to man, if he would, and the boy had gone very still, and then nodded once with the gravity of someone receiving an honor they intended to carry properly. Eliza braided June's hair for the occasion, and the twins wore matching clean shirts, and did not hit each other for the full duration of the ceremony, which was considered by all present to be an achievement of the highest order. Ruth carried Clara, who was dressed in white with a pink sash, and who was very interested in a moth that had gotten into the church, and spent the ceremony attempting to pursue it. The whole town of Millhaven came. It was a small town, and a Wednesday had already been spent discussing the widow at Bancroft's place, and whether it would come to anything. So by the Saturday of the wedding, the whole town had decided they had an investment in the outcome. Aldrich from the general store sat in the front row and cried, which surprised everyone including Aldrich. The doctor's wife brought a cake. The blacksmith's family took up an entire pew. When Holly said the words and Micah and Pauline said them back to each other, she looked at him with the fullness of her attention, the way she had given him from the beginning, and he thought that everything he had built on this land and everything he had endured to be here was exactly the right price for this exact moment. He kissed her, brief and honest, and the town of Millhaven applauded, and June shouted hooray. with an enthusiasm that made everyone laugh, and Clara caught her moth. The life they built after that was not without difficulty, because a life without difficulty is a different kind of life entirely, and not the kind that was on offer in Kansas in 1879. There was the summer of the dry spell, when the creek dropped to a trickle, and the grass went yellow, and Micah and Thomas, and two hired hands from town, worked 18-hour days hauling water to the cattle. Pauline organized the household water use with a precision that Micah marveled at, making the supply stretch further than seemed possible, and she kept the kitchen garden alive through sheer determined attention, carrying water from the deepest part of the creek herself in the early mornings before the heat built. They lost some cattle, not as many as others, and they came through the dry season with the herd diminished but viable and themselves unbroken. There was the matter of the Conley brother, Warren's kin, who arrived in Millhaven one October afternoon with a lawyer from Topeka and a letter of demand relating to some personal property he claimed belonged to the estate. Pauline met him in the front yard without invitation, and listened to what he had to say with her arms crossed and her face very still. And then she told him in clear and measured language that she had paid the estate's debt in labor and grief, and that she did not have anything of his, and that if he wished to press the matter further, he was welcome to discuss it with the sheriff at Millhaven. And she said it with such complete calm authority that the Conley brother left without pressing anything further, and the lawyer from Topeka could be seen out the window getting his horse with a speed that suggested he had reassessed the situation. Micah, who had been in the barn and had come to the yard when he heard a wagon he didn't recognize, arrived to find the Conley brother already retreating and Pauline still standing in the yard with her arms uncrossed now and her expression shifting from steel to something more tired. He came and stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "He is a small man pretending to be a large one. I have met the type." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him briefly, just briefly, the way she did when she allowed herself to be held, and then she straightened and said they needed to get the children in for supper, and they did. Thomas turned 14 that winter, and had by then become indispensable to the running of the ranch in a way that Micah spoke about to anyone who would listen, which was mostly Aldrich and Reverend Holly's, and whichever cowboys came through looking for work. The boy had grown 3 inches and filled out in the shoulders, and had his mother's capacity for careful thought combined with a physical fearlessness that was entirely his own. He was not reckless, he was precise, and there is a difference. He could read a cow's condition and read a fence line and read the weather, and he was beginning to read men, which was the most useful skill of all in ranch country. Eliza, at 13, had read every book in a 20-mile radius and had begun writing to a pen correspondent in Kansas City who published a small gazette. She was, Micah thought privately, going to be a person of very large effect someday, and he felt something proprietary and proud about that which he examined occasionally and found to be the feeling of a father, which startled him still sometimes with its completeness. The twins were 10 and had settled, somewhat, into a rivalry that was mostly constructive. Samuel had a gift with horses that emerged quietly and grew steadily, the animals responding to something in him that was gentle beneath the exterior noise. Daniel was the one who fixed things, who dismantled broken objects and reassembled them working, who had opinions about axle grease that he expressed with more passion than most people managed about anything. June at 6 was a person of boundless energy and extreme opinions who had decided she wanted to be a teacher, or possibly a veterinarian for large animals, or possibly the first woman to run a general store in Millhaven. She had not ruled anything out. She was also still deeply committed to Sargent, who was growing gray around his muzzle but who had adopted June as his special person and followed her everywhere with devoted arthritic patience. Ruth at 5 had emerged from her solemnity into something unexpected, a dry wit that appeared at the most surprising moments, delivered from a small, solemn face in a voice so level that it took a second to register. Micah had fallen completely and helplessly in love with Ruth's humor the day she watched the twins argue about the correct way to stack firewood and said, without looking up from the doll she was dressing, "You are both wrong and the wood does not care," and then went back to her doll while everyone else in the kitchen tried not to laugh. Clara, who was 3 by then, was discovering language with the thoroughness of a scholar and the creativity of a poet, applying words to things in combinations that were sometimes accurate and sometimes spectacularly not, but always expressed with complete conviction. It was in the autumn of 1880 that Pauline told Micah she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before the children were up, with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him across the table with steady brown eyes and waiting. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. And then he stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with a reverence that he felt to the bottom of his bones, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I wanted to make sure before I said anything." "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked up at him, and her face was entirely open in a way it had not always been open, the particular guarded quality she had worn when they first met long since shed, and she said, "I am the happiest I have been in a very long time, Micah Bancroft." He held her face for another moment, and then he sat back down and picked up his coffee, and she picked up hers, and they sat in the early morning quiet of their kitchen in a companionable and full-hearted silence. They told the children at supper. The reactions were predictable and wonderful. June immediately claimed naming rights and was immediately overruled. Daniel asked whether it would be a boy or a girl, and Ruth said they could not know yet, and Daniel said, well, they ought to figure it out. Samuel asked if Sergeant would like the baby, which was a question nobody else had thought of, but which June immediately said was very important. Thomas, at the end of the table, smiled the quiet, complete smile of someone for whom this news meant something more than he could easily say, and caught Micah's eye and nodded once, and Micah nodded back. Eliza came to her mother after supper and stood close and said, very quietly, "Mama, are you all right with all of this?" And Pauline looked at her daughter with an expression full of love and said, "I am the rightest I have been in a long time, my girl." And Eliza hugged her, which Eliza did not do often and which therefore meant a great deal. The baby came in May of 1881, in the last of the spring, the prairie in full wild flower, the cottonwoods fully leafed, and the cattle fat on the new grass. It was a boy, a large, healthy boy who announced his arrival with considerable volume, and who had Micah's dark hair and Pauline's brown eyes, and a chin that appeared to belong to both of them. They named him James Warren Bancroft, and when Micah held him for the first time, standing in the bedroom of the house he had built on the Kansas plain, this child, who was the first child who was entirely his and entirely not his, because all 6 of those other children upstairs were as entirely his as any blood could make them, he felt something that had no word in the English language but which was in the vicinity of completion. James was, as his mother had been at the beginning, a person of directness and volume. He had opinions about hunger that he communicated without ambiguity. He had preferences about position and contact that were clear and immediate. He was, in short, a Conley Bancroft, which meant he knew what he wanted and was not shy about it. Thomas, at 16, handled his new brother with the careful confidence of a boy who had been helping with babies his whole life. He would hold James in the barn sometimes while he talked to the horses, giving his brother the benefit of his own particular form of calm, and the baby would go quiet and watchful in a way that made Samuel observe that James was going to be a horseman, which made Thomas look pleased. The years that followed were full years, built years, years that accumulated the particular richness of a life that has been genuinely lived. Millhaven grew. A second general store opened, and then a proper hotel, and then a bank, and the town began to look less like a frontier outpost and more like a permanent fixture, which was something Micah found quietly satisfying because he had built his own permanent fixture here and liked having company in the conviction. He hired 2 permanent hands, brothers named Pete and Carol Wainwright, who were decent and reliable, and who learned within a month that the Bancroft Ranch was the kind of operation where you worked hard and were treated fairly and ate well, and who stayed accordingly. Thomas, as he grew into 17 and 18, became a third essential member of the operation, not as a hand but as a partner, and Micah began to transfer knowledge to him with the deliberateness of a man building a legacy. The conversation happened on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883 when Thomas was 17, out on the east pasture, riding the fence line that Thomas himself had rebuilt at 13. It was one of those Kansas days that was entirely impossible to argue with, the sky so blue it seemed painted, the grass green gold and moving in long swells like a slow ocean, the air warm and clean. "I want to stay," Thomas said, not looking at Micah, looking at the fence. "You don't have to," Micah said. "There's a lot of country out there." "I know that," Thomas said. "I want to stay here. I want to run this place when you can't." He paused. "With you, I mean while you're running it too, but eventually." Micah looked at him, this boy who had stood beside him at his own wedding, this boy who had become in some quiet and incontestable way his son. "This is your place," Micah said. "It always has been." Thomas finally looked at him, and there was something in the boy's eyes, in the young man's eyes, that was full and certain and grateful without being sentimental. "Thank you," Thomas said, "for everything." Micah nodded and looked back at the fence. "The northwest corner post is going to need replacing this summer," he said. "I know," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about cedar versus pine." And they rode on. Eliza left for Kansas City in 1884, at 18, with a letter of introduction to the Gazette she had been corresponding with, and a trunk full of books, and the quiet, fierce determination that Micah had recognized in her at age 10, when she had carried a trunk that should have required a grown man through his door in the rain. She cried at the train station in Millhaven with a single-mindedness that was also very Eliza, and she hugged each of her siblings with the thoroughness of a person conducting an inventory, and she held her mother for a long time, and then she turned to Micah and looked at him straight on and said, "You made it possible." And then she was on the train before he could respond, which was probably intentional. Pauline took his arm on the platform and they watched the train go, and she said, "She'll do great things." "I know," he said. "She already has," Pauline said, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. The second baby, another boy, came in 1883, before Eliza left, and they named him Robert after Micah's father, who had died in Missouri the previous winter. Robert was from the beginning a different animal than James, quieter and more watchful, a serious infant who became a serious toddler who examined everything with enormous brown eyes before touching it, as though cataloging it first. He became June's particular project, June being 9 when he was born, and deciding immediately that Robert needed her specific guidance in life, which Robert accepted with a patience that suggested he had already understood something about June that most adults took years to learn. The twins reached their teenage years and became, if possible, more themselves. Samuel's gift with horses had grown into something that people came from neighboring counties to consult. He had a boy's way with a difficult animal that could not be taught, only observed, and by the time he was 16, ranchers who had problems were sending for Samuel Conley Bancroft with the matter-of-fact faith that people place in genuine gifts. Daniel, meanwhile, had progressed from fixing broken axles to building things from scratch, had apprenticed himself to a carpenter in Millhaven for a summer, and had come back with skills that he immediately applied to the expansion of the barn, which he designed and largely constructed with Thomas's help and the Wainwright brothers' labor. June, who reached 15 in 1890, had not narrowed her ambitions but had refined them. She still wanted to teach, she had decided, and she had begun in the informal way that was available to her, tutoring the younger Millhaven children whose parents could not always get them to the church schoolroom. sitting with them in the Bancroft kitchen with the patience of a born teacher, and the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed that understanding something was the most exciting thing that could happen to a person. Ruth, quiet and dry and observant, was 14 and had begun writing in a journal she kept under her bed, in a hand so small and precise that it took a magnifying lens to read. Not that Micah would have read it without permission, but he noticed the journal the way he noticed things about all of them, with a tender attention he had not known he was capable of before they came into his life. Clara, who had grown from a doll-clutching toddler into a quick, laughing, long-legged girl of 12, was the one who was hardest to characterize, except to say that she was entirely herself, and that this was a remarkable thing in a person of 12. She had Warren Conley's coloring and Pauline's eyes, and something in her face that was neither of them but purely its own person. She was funny, incisively so, in the way that Ruth was funny but louder and less controlled, and she made Sergeant, in the dog's last year, get up from his rug and come to find out what the noise was about, which Micah thought was as good a tribute as any to Clara's ability to make a room feel alive. Sergeant died on a warm October morning in 1890, on his rug by the stove, in the way that is described as peaceful because there was no violence in it and nothing incomplete. He was old for a hound, very old, and he had been Micah's companion through the years of solitude and through the years of fullness, and his absence from the rug was a specific and solid grief that sat in the kitchen for days. June held a small service in the yard, which nobody laughed at. She said that Sergeant had been the best dog and the most loyal friend, and had loved everyone in the house without exception, and with varying degrees of drool. Thomas built a marker for the yard out of cedar. Clara put wildflowers on it every morning for 2 weeks. They got a new puppy in the spring, a yellow hound that Robert named Henry, and that immediately began the process of being exactly as important as Sergeant had been, in his own way, in his own time. On a spring evening in 1891, Micah and Pauline sat on the porch as they had begun to do on warm evenings when the work of the day was done, and the house was full of the various sounds of their children. He was 47. She was 43. They had been married 12 years, which was not a long time in one sense and a complete and entire life in another sense, both of those things true simultaneously. The prairie was gold in the last of the evening light, and the cattle were dark shapes on the east pasture, and somewhere behind them Thomas was laughing at something one of the twins had said, and Robert's voice came high and clear, asking June a question that June was answering with characteristic certainty. "Are you happy?" he asked her, the way he had asked on that morning 12 years ago when she told him about James. She looked at him with those brown eyes that were lined now at the corners in the way of a woman who has laughed and worried, and lived fully in her face. "Micah," she said, "I knocked on a stranger's door in the dark in the rain with 6 children and $20 and a horse with a bad leg, and what was on the other side of that door was this." She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the porch and the land and the golden evening and everything behind them in the house. "I am so happy that I am sometimes frightened of it, the way you are frightened of things that are too good to believe." He took her hand. Her hand was warm and familiar and entirely his. "Don't be frightened," he said. "I try not to be," she said. "You help." He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and they sat in the evening quiet of the life they had built, and the prairie went gold and then amber, and then the first stars came out over Kansas, enormous and unhurried, the way they always were out here where there was nothing between you and the sky. Thomas married in the summer of 1893, a young woman named Catherine Aldrich, the general store owner's daughter, who had grown up knowing the Bancroft family by reputation and proximity, and who had looked at Thomas specifically for about 3 years before Thomas looked back, which Catherine's father said was exactly how these things ought to go. The wedding was at the same church in Millhaven where Micah and Pauline had married, and Pauline wore a blue dress she had made herself, and Micah wore the same dark coat, taken in slightly because the years of ranch work had kept him lean. Thomas and Catherine took the rooms above the barn initially and began building their own house on the north quarter of the land that Micah had set aside for that purpose years before, because he had always imagined the land being used this way, and the imagining was now a fact. Samuel, who had by his late teens become the most sought-after horse handler in the county, took a position in the autumn of 1893, managing the stables for a larger operation 2 counties east, with the understanding that he would come back on his own terms when he was ready, which he did 2 years later with enough money saved to buy a small adjoining parcel and the skills to do something real with it. He was settled and purposeful, and had a quiet courtship with a shy girl from a neighboring homestead that resolved itself in a wedding so understated it was almost entirely over before anyone registered it had begun, which was completely Samuel, and everyone was extremely fond of his wife Harriet from the first moment. Daniel's carpentry had become an actual business, which he ran out of Millhaven, and which grew steadily as the town and the surrounding area grew. He built houses and barns and church pews and furniture, and he had a reputation for quality that kept him busy and solvent and deeply satisfied. He remained, of the twins, the one more likely to turn up for supper unexpectedly, arriving with sawdust in his hair and an appetite that had not diminished since he was 8 years old. Eliza wrote from Kansas City. She wrote often and well, which was not surprising. She had published pieces in the Kansas City Gazette and in 2 other papers, pieces about the frontier and about women's lives there, written with her particular mix of precision and feeling. She came home for Christmas most years and filled the house with the specific energy of someone who has been living a big life and is temporarily contracting it to fit within 4 walls, which it barely did. June did become a teacher. She earned a certificate and took a position at the Millhaven School when the previous teacher retired, and she taught with a passion that the children of Millhaven felt immediately, and that their parents discussed with varying degrees of understanding and universal appreciation. She lived at home, at least initially, which Pauline privately appreciated, and which June treated as a perfectly logical arrangement, since the house was large and she was needed, and she was building her savings for when she was ready to do something larger with them. Ruth, at 19, was still the one Pauline said she was least sure about and most certain of, which was a paradox that made complete sense if you knew Ruth. She had finished the journal she kept under her bed and started another, and she had sent a piece of writing to a paper in Wichita without telling anyone, and the paper had printed it, and that was how the family found out. She was 20 when she sent her second piece, and this time she told them ahead, sitting at the breakfast table with the careful composure of a person announcing something significant in the most ordinary tones available. "I sent something to the Wichita Eagle," she said, passing the biscuits. "They say they will print it in the Thursday edition." The table erupted. June knocked over her coffee. Daniel cheered. Thomas, who had come by for breakfast as he often did now that the North House was standing, stood up and went around and hugged his sister, who accepted this with dignified surprise. Micah looked at Pauline across the table, and she was looking at him, and there was a shared comprehension between them, a pride so large it was nearly painful, for this child who had been 4 years old and solemn-faced in the rain, carrying her baby sister with the seriousness of a much older person, who was now a woman of 20, and finding her way into the world on the strength of words she had written in a very small hand under her bed at night. Clara, who was 22 by 1891 and had been working at the Aldrich store since she was 18, had also taken up with a young man who drove the supply wagon from Topeka, a reliable and cheerful man named Frank Delaney, who had the considerable advantage of making Clara laugh in the specific way that meant she was not managing the impression she made, but was simply happy. They were courting with the comfortable ease of 2 people who have already made up their minds and are working out the practical details. And Micah and Pauline watched this with the quiet satisfaction of parents who recognize a good match when it is standing in their kitchen eating their biscuits. James, who was 12 in 1893, was the child who most resembled his father in temperament, which was something Pauline observed one evening with the clear-eyed perception she had always had. "He watches everything before he speaks," she said. "He counts things. He thinks about the land the way you do." "Is that a problem?" Micah asked. "It is not a problem," she said. "It is a gift. I am only saying that he is yours in a way I can see plainly." Micah looked out the window at James, who was in the yard watching the horses with the calm attentiveness of a boy who is calculating something. "He is also yours," he said. "He has your stubbornness." "That is not stubbornness," Pauline said. "That is determination. There is a difference." "In my family there is," she said, and he laughed, and she laughed, and James turned in the yard and saw them in the window and raised a hand in a brief wave, entirely unself-conscious, and went back to watching the horses. Robert, the younger of the two boys they had together, was 10 in 1893, and had developed an interest in medicine that had begun with a wounded bird he found, and escalated through a series of animal patients to the conviction that he wanted to be a doctor. He went about this conviction in Robert's characteristic way, which was methodical and thorough, reading everything he could find on the subject, and asking the Millhaven doctor questions with such precision that the doctor had eventually begun inviting him along on less complicated calls, which Pauline and Micah had discussed and allowed on the grounds that a genuine gift ought to be given room. The ranch grew. The cattle herd doubled, and then stabilized at a size that was manageable and profitable. A second bunkhouse was built, Daniel's work clean and solid. The east pasture fence that had been a subject of discussion since Thomas was 12 was rebuilt a second time properly, with cedar posts that would last for decades. The kitchen garden that Pauline had nursed through the dry summer of 1882 was now a proper vegetable garden with frames for the winter vegetables, and a root cellar that Daniel had expanded and lined with stone. The house, which had been big when Micah lived in it alone, and which had immediately become full when the Conleys arrived, had been added to twice: a back room for the wash-house, a wider porch that ran the full length of the front, a covered breezeway connecting the house to the barn that Micah had built himself over a winter when he had the time and the inclination. The house was, by 1893, entirely their house, not the house Micah had built before them or the house they had moved into, but the house that had been made by the accumulation of their specific and collective life, and it looked it. There were evenings when Micah would stand in the yard at dusk and look at it, the yellow light in the windows, the shapes moving through the rooms, the sound of voices and of supper, and of a house fully inhabited, and he would feel something that was too large to name and too specific to generalize, the precise feeling of a man whose life has exceeded what he knew to ask for. In November of 1893, Pauline sat down at the kitchen table with a letter from Abilene that had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and that was from her sister Margaret, who she had written to and received letters from with an improving regularity since the years of silence had finally been broken, which had happened in a letter Pauline wrote after the wedding in 1879, 2 years after the argument that had created the silence. Margaret had written back within the month, and they had been rebuilding ever since, slowly, and with the particular careful honesty of two women who are too old for pretense and too fond of each other for continued distance. The letter from Margaret said that she was not well and that the doctor in Abilene had said she should not be alone, and she had no one. Pauline read the letter twice, and then she put it down on the table and she looked at the window for a while. Micah came in from the yard and found her there, and he sat down across from her and waited, because he had learned to read the quality of her silences. She told him about the letter. She told him what it said. She told him what she thought they ought to do. "You want to bring her here," he said. "Yes," she said, "if you are willing." He looked at her. "Pauline," he said, "we have 4 spare bedrooms. We have more food than we can eat before it turns. I have been saying so since the night you arrived. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You have," she said. "Write to her," he said. "Tell her to come." Margaret Ferris arrived in December of 1893, thinner than Pauline had expected and older in the ways that illness makes people older, but with the same humor and the same stubborn angle to her chin that ran in their family. The reunion in the front yard was wordless on Pauline's part and wordful on Margaret's. Margaret talking the whole way from the wagon to the door as though filling in 7 years of silence in a single breath. And Pauline held her arm and brought her in out of the cold and sat her by the fire and made coffee. And the house absorbed one more person as it had always absorbed people, with room to spare. Margaret settled into the house the way a person settles into a place that is healing them, incrementally and with increasing ease. The children adopted her. June made it her project to make Margaret laugh at least once per day, which June accomplished beginning on the second day with a story about the twins and the chickens that was technically true and spectacularly embellished. Ruth brought her books and discussed them with her in the careful way Ruth discussed things, as an equal, as though Margaret's opinion mattered and was expected to be worth hearing, which it was. James showed her the horses with the quiet pride of a boy sharing something he loves. Margaret said to Pauline sometime in January, "You have done something extraordinary here." "Micah did the land," Pauline said. "I don't mean the land," Margaret said. Margaret's health improved over the winter, as the doctor in Millhaven had thought it might with proper rest and regular meals and warmth. And by spring, she was moving around the house with more energy and helping Pauline with the garden in the mornings. And the sisters had their conversations in the evenings that were the conversations of women who have been apart too long and are making up for it. Micah gave them the space for these conversations, with the understanding of a man who knows that some things are between sisters. Clara married Frank Delaney in the spring of 1894, and they settled in Millhaven, where Frank took a position at the livery stable and Clara, being Clara, promptly assessed the town's needs and opened a small millinery and dry goods shop in the space next to Aldrich's store. Because Frank's income was reliable, but Clara had opinions about income and ownership that she had inherited from her mother. The shop was an immediate success, partly because Clara had taste and partly because Clara had the family gift for knowing what people needed before they knew it themselves. James turned 13 in 1894 and was increasingly inseparable from the horses and from Thomas, who had taken the boy under his wing in the way Thomas took things under his wing, quietly and completely. James was going to be a rancher, which was clear to everyone including James, and he wore this fact with a contentment that made Micah, watching him, feel something that was entirely and completely fatherly. Robert was 11 and had been present at 2 difficult calving operations and 1 complicated treatment of a horse's abscessed hoof, and had been more useful than most adults in all 3 situations. And the Millhaven doctor had told Micah privately that the boy had genuine aptitude and ought to be given the opportunity to pursue it seriously when he was old enough. Micah had told Pauline this word for word, and she had pressed her lips together in the particular way she had when she was managing a feeling she did not want to display immediately, and then she had said, "He will need to go east, for schooling." "Yes," Micah said. "That is years away," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached across and put her hand on his on the table. "We will manage it," she said, which was what she said about things she had already decided to accomplish. In the autumn of 1895, on a Saturday in October when the plains had gone that particular autumn gold that seemed to Micah to be the truest color of Kansas, when the air had the clean edge of approaching cold and the sky was absolutely clear, Micah and Pauline walked the east pasture the way they sometimes did in the evenings, just the 2 of them, the house full behind them and the land spread out before them. He was 51. She was 47. Their oldest child, Thomas, was 29 and had 2 children of his own, Micah's grandchildren, a boy of 4 and a girl of 2, who came to the main house for Sunday dinners and whom Micah held with the startled tenderness of a man who had not expected to be a grandfather and found it entirely to his liking. 6 of their 8 children were within 20 miles. 2 were further, Eliza in Kansas City and Samuel 2 counties east, but both were well and both came home for Christmas and sometimes for Easter, and the table those times required every chair in the house and a bench brought in from the barn. They walked to the creek on the north quarter, the one that had never gone dry even in the worst of the drought years, and they sat on the bank in the October evening, and Pauline put her head on his shoulder the way she did sometimes when they were alone and there was no performance required of either of them. "I think about that night sometimes," she said. "The rain, the wrong road." "So do I," he said. "I was so frightened," she said. "Not of you. I knew immediately you were safe, but of needing someone. Of starting over. You have never given any indication of being frightened," he said. "That is something I learned from you," she said. He looked at her. "From me." "You opened the door," she said. "You did not ask questions. You simply opened the door and stood aside. That was the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me, because you did not know what you were opening the door to." He put his arm around her on the creek bank. The water moved past them, quiet and clear. "I knew enough," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him, and she was the woman in the rain with the steady eyes, and she was also the woman who had sat across the fire from him on Christmas night and said she was frightened, and she was the woman who had stood in this yard and faced down the Conley brother without flinching, and she was the woman who had laughed at the twins and worried about Eliza on the train and held Robert through his first fever and danced in this kitchen one spring morning when she thought nobody was looking. And she was all of these women simultaneously, and he loved all of them with the particular completeness that comes from knowing someone entirely. "Micah Bancroft," she said. "Pauline Bancroft," he said. She smiled, that low, sudden smile that had always been worth working for, and then she kissed him, there on the creek bank in the October evening, with the land spread out around them and the house behind them full of their life. They walked back in the early dark, the lights of the house warm and yellow through the windows, the sound of supper beginning inside, June's voice and Daniel's laugh and Margaret saying something in her dry way that made someone else bark with surprised laughter. Micah held the back door open for her. She paused in the doorway and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for being on the other side of that door." He looked at her in the warm light from the kitchen, his wife of 16 years, the mother of 6 and then 8, the woman who had arrived in the rain at what she thought was the wrong door and had turned out to be exactly the right one, and he thought of every year that had led him here, every fence post and cold morning and silent evening and patient choice, and he understood finally and completely what he had been waiting for. "Thank you," he said, "for knocking." And they went inside, into the noise and the warmth and the particular beautiful chaos of their life, and the door closed behind them on the Kansas night, and the stars came out enormous and unhurried over the prairie, and the creek on the north quarter ran clear and steady, as it always had, as it would for a very long time to come.